Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Understanding and Optimizing Inventory and Supply Chains. Our hosts today are Amar Ramudhin and Don Ratliff. Dr. Ramudhin has over 25 years of experience in the design and management of supply chains for both the manufacturing and service industries. He currently serves as the Director of Supply Chain Management and Technology at Georgia Tech Supply Chain and Logistics Institute and has held senior positions with companies such as CAPS Logistics and Vaughn. Amar earned his PhD from the Georgia Institute of Technology and is also the president of the software development company Blue Sail Solutions. Dr. Ratliff is a supply chain and logistics expert with more than 30 years of experience as an educator, researcher, consultant, and technology business executive. As executive director of the Supply Chain and Logistics Institute, he provides leadership for the largest research program in the world devoted to the study of supply chains and logistics. Concepts developed by Don and his colleagues have been implemented in decision support systems for logistics network design, shipment planning, production scheduling, and vehicle routing. He's also co-founder of CAPS Logistics, a company that specialized in flexible logistics software. Don was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1996 and is a fellow of the Institute of Industrial Engineers. He received IIE's Outstanding Research Award for his work in logistics. With that introduction, I will turn the webinar over to Don.
Thank you, Andy. What we'd like to do is talk a little bit about what we're going to do in the inventory course, but I think that the easiest way to do that is to just start and talk about inventory basics. And the first thing is to make it clear to everybody what we're talking about when we're talking about inventory. In our context, inventory is the stuff. And so it can be raw materials, it can be merchandise, it can be parts, finished goods, unfinished goods, anything to be sold. Some people also consider that they have inventories of things like trucks. And if the trucks are assets that you're going to use to move the products, then we're not going to consider that to be inventory. We'll consider those to be a different category. So when we talk about inventory, we're talking about the products. So we're talking about the stuff that we're going to store, we're going to move, we're going to sell, we're going to buy. So all of that is generally what we mean by inventory. And the first question is why have inventory? Why do you need to have inventory at all? And if you think about what is ideal, then an ideal environment would be that you'd have demand that occurred, you'd have your products instantly appear to satisfy the demand, and you would satisfy your demand. You wouldn't have to have any inventory at all. So you'd have somebody would say, okay, I want to buy this product. You'd say, okay, I'll sell you this product, and the product would magically appear. And if we look and ask why the world is not ideal, the first is it requires time to produce products. So we can't just magically create most products. The other thing is that time is required to deliver the products. So generally, the products are not made at the point where the customer wants to buy the products. So time is required to produce the products, and time is required to get them to the customer. At the same time, the customers will not wait an unlimited amount of time. So you could think of a system where you didn't produce anything until the customer wanted it, and then you made it to order. And there's a lot of people who try to do something that is akin to make it to order. But we all know that the customer will have a limited amount of time. If you're thinking about buying a car, you're not going to wait the weeks, in some cases months, it takes to get all of the parts manufactured, to get them assembled, and to get the car and get it to you. If you try to think of ideal environments, you can think of a few. One that comes immediately to mind is all of the digital products. Now we download music, we download books, And so for those products, it is ideal. You don't actually have to have any inventory of those products. They're created on demand, or essentially on demand. Most services are kind of produced on demand. If it's the case that you're going to the location the service is going to be provided, then the service is not inventoried in the same way, at least we think about products being inventoried. And in fact, if you don't use the service, then the service will go away. If it's the case that you have some capability and you don't use the capability, it's gone. So that would be an ideal inventory environment, and we have a few, but not very many. And mostly, if you look at the future is going to look similar. We're going to make products. We're going to have to move those products. The products are not going to be made at the same place that the customer wants the products. So because of that, we're going to have to maintain some inventories. Now, the sort of next question is, how are you going to measure inventory? And as we sort of start with, there's all kinds of things that could be in inventory. And so we need some ways to measure inventory, and ideally we need some ways that are common. And there are a couple which are generally accepted. The probably most common way for us to think about inventory is to think about days of inventory. And it's a simple concept, and what the way to think about it is that a day of inventory is the amount of product I would sell in a day. So if I have 1 day's supply, so and since demand is not necessarily constant, generally we'll think about an average day. If I have 1 day's supply, then I will have 1 day of inventory. So if I had 200 cars at a car dealer, and the dealer sold an average of 5 cars per day, then I'd have 40 days of inventory. So if I don't have any more inventory that comes in, then I'll have 40 days before I run out. Now, I may not have the right kind of cars, but I'll at least have cars. The biggest advantage to days of inventory is it's easily understood. So if you're talking about cars, I can talk about days of inventory. If I'm talking about shirts, I can talk about days of inventory. If I'm talking about parts, I can talk about days of inventory, and we all can communicate. We also have some, if we understand the environment, we have some intuition with regard to whether the amount of days of inventory I have is reasonable or not. If you tell me that I have 600 days of inventory, I'd say, okay, that's a lot of inventory. The other common way to talk about inventory is in terms of inventory turns. And inventory turns is also not hard to calculate. If you take the average days of inventory in this example of 40, then inventory turns, you just divide that number into 365. So you get a little over 9 turns a year. Now, what the fundamental notion there is that if you were bringing inventory in, how many times would you be able to, if you kept a certain amount of inventory, how many times would you be able to sell it all and replenish it? The problem with it is that it's often used, but it's not terribly helpful in that mostly what we have to do is take the number of inventory turns, and in our head we translate it into days of inventory. So in the course, generally, we will talk about days of inventory. The next thing is inventory cost. Cost is generally expressed as a percentage of inventory value. So if I say it's 10%, and I have $1 million worth of inventory, what I mean is that it costs me $100,000 a year to have that $1 million worth of inventory. Now, there's a variety of problems with the way we try to estimate inventory cost. One is that it varies a lot, typically from 5% to 50%. And second, it's a very, very crude estimate of what the actual cost is. There are some things that are relatively easy to think about the cost associated with inventory, like the cost of money. But there are a lot of other things like obsolescence, the likelihood that it'll be damaged, those kind of things, which are much, much harder to get a number on. The big thing that we have to remember about inventory is if we have less of it, we have more cash. And in fact, inventory appears on the balance sheet. So inventory, the amount of inventory you have is a big deal to the CFO. And if the CFO can have less inventory, that says the CEO has more money to invest. All right.
Don, before you move on, we have a question from the audience. Work in progress, is that considered as inventory, and is it measured in the same way?
It is considered as inventory, and often it is measured in the same way, in the sense that you talk about how many dollars worth of work in progress you have. Now, work in progress is a lot harder to value how much value you have in work in progress. And in this course, we will spend a very little bit of time. We'll touch on work in progress, but we won't spend very much time on work in progress. Okay. It turns out that while we've had inventory forever, and people have been concerned about inventory forever, supply chains have changed a lot over time. And our view of inventory has to some degree changed with it. We, starting way back with the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, we had all job shops. So we had, the way manufacturing was done is you'd have a small shop, and within that shop you'd make everything you need. And mostly all of the parts that you needed and all of the raw materials you needed were located relatively close to the job shop. In the 1900s, Henry Ford came up with the idea of assembly lines. And with assembly lines, it meant that you did not make everything you needed to go into a car at the assembly line. You typically made the parts in one location, and then you assembled the parts in some other location. So as soon as there were assembly lines, then there had to be some sort of inventories of parts that went into the car. And the first inventory models that we know about were in the very early 1900s. So the economic order quantity, which is a model that we'll talk about in the course, and it's a model to try to figure out how much you should buy when you make a purchase of inventory, was actually developed around 1900, in the very early 1900s. And it's a model that a lot of people use today, and in the course we'll explain both what the model is and why in many cases today it's not a great model to use for this purpose. In the 1940s, World War II, was sort of the birthplace of logistics systems, when people realized that logistics was a big deal. The U.S. was supplying troops to fight two wars, and so logistics became a much bigger thing. The idea of lean, particularly lean manufacturing, was developed by the Japanese after World War II, because they were trying to catch up, particularly in automotive manufacturing. And a lot of those concepts are still being implemented. Now, it's interesting to note that computers, most of this stuff was done before we thought at all about computers. So we had computers that were in the 1960s, mainframe computers. We had a big change in personal computers development in the 1980s. We had the internet, late 1990s. Now we have cloud computing. Now all of that fundamentally, particularly the first part, fundamentally changed inventory, because prior to that we had a very hard time knowing what we had. So everything was kept in paper. If you wanted to know what your inventory was, in fact, if you wanted to know whether or not you had inventory, typically what you had to do was go out and look. You had to go out and see if you actually had the parts. So personal computers gave much more direct access to people. Internet connected everybody up. So now you not only had access, but you had connectivity everywhere. Cloud computing is going to be the next generation, and for our purposes, what it basically means is that much of the technology will be available in a much nicer way. The big tipping point with regard to supply chains came about in 1990. 1990 was when China got into the export business. Prior to 1990, about that period, China didn't export anything. So this whole idea of global trade and global manufacturing is a relatively new concept, in that China is one of the biggest, if not the biggest player, and they were not in the business at all before 1990. So what we've had since 1990 is this big focus on global trade, and it has fundamentally changed the way we have to think about inventory. So everything is different than it was prior to that. Early on, the focus was on processes with regard to supply chains. In the 1940s, we didn't abandon processes, but had to look much more at systems, and particularly systems of processes. And then starting with 1990 about, the focus has shifted much more to networks. And so you might ask, why does that matter? Well, it matters in lots of ways. If you look at this chart, what we see is that starting about 2001 or so, the amount of world trade started increasing at about a linear rate. So it went up at about a linear rate till the recession of 2009. And in 2009, we took this huge dive. So if you look at, if you were doing any kind of forecasting of what this line would look like back in 2007, you would assume that it would just keep on growing at this linear rate, which it didn't. And in terms of inventory, what happened in 2009 is we had this huge downturn, which made it extremely hard to get money. So people could not get money. You could not borrow money. The banks would not loan you money. And if you don't have money, you can't buy inventory. So the pressures on inventory became much, much greater. And companies started thinking, okay, I've been a little lax. Money's been cheap. I've assumed this was not going to be a problem. Now I have a problem. And so since 2009, most companies are much, much more aware of their inventory than they were before. And they're much more concerned about how you do it.
We have a question for the audience at this point, and you can turn in your answer by typing it in. Think about inventory and what Don just said, and think about the following question. Does inventory ever add value to your product? Is inventory adding any value to your product? Please type in your answers, and we'll address that later.
Okay, if we look at these global supply chains, there's a number of things that you can observe about them. First, you've got these value-added pieces, and these often now occur in different countries. So if you look at where the raw materials made, where the parts are made, where the parts are assembled, it is frequently the case that these will be in different countries. we have the traditional places where we've had inventory. And traditionally, that's been most of the inventory has been in two locations, in warehouses and in the retail outlet, the place that you were going to sell the product. And when you look at all of the inventory models that you probably know about, they are focused on trying to determine how much inventory you should have in those two locations. Now, what's happened with these global supply chains is that there's been this big shift in where inventory is. And now for many, many companies, there is as much or more product out there in ships and trains and trucks as there is in the traditional warehouse and retail outlets. And what's worse is there is a lot of product that is waiting for a container to put it in, waiting on a ship to put the container on, waiting on the ship to be unloaded, waiting on a train to get it to its next location. So there's just a lot of places where it's waiting. So if you look and you ask yourself now, where is the inventory? There's inventory everywhere. So it's not the case that inventory is sort of hemmed up in these locations, retail and warehouse. Now inventory is out there in a lot of places where you have a very hard time even understanding what's there. So the characteristics are, first, we have very long lead times. To get from China to Atlanta, 30 days is typically pretty quick. So it takes much longer than it would if I'm buying a product and selling it in Atlanta. It takes much longer if I buy it from China than it would if I were buying it from Alabama. The second characteristic is there's multiple transportation modes. We change the product from one mode to another. Use truck to get it to the port, ship to get it to the next port, truck to get it to the train to get it to the next location, etc. So every time we have to change the product from one mode to another, there's the potential for delay, and there is often delay. You have to wait on the truck or wait on the train or wait on the ship. There's inventory all through the chain, so inventory everywhere. And we have limited visibility of what's out there. Generally, we have pretty good visibility. If I'm looking for a particular container, then I generally can find at least the last place where the container was. But if I'm looking for visibility, like how much product do I have waiting in the port of Hong Kong, then this is a much harder thing typically for me to know. The consequences are fulfillment is a much more complex process. So I'm sitting out here on the end of the chain, and it's much more complex for me to deal with fulfillment. It's a lot harder for me to assess even how much inventory I have. I have lots of different kinds of inventory. I have more and more SKUs. They're in more and more locations. Some of them are still and some of them are moving. Some of them are in my computer system and some not. So all of that is difficult. It becomes much more necessary to forecast because if I'm interested on the retail part, I need to make sure that when somebody comes in to buy a product that I have the product. So I need to do forecasting. I also need to do planning. The stuff it's going to take it a long time to get there. There's a lot of variability, so I need to worry about how I'm going to plan it. And something that we'll talk about a good bit in the course is that transportation is a major driver. Prior to there being these complex supply chains, transportation wasn't really a big factor. If all your supply is located close to you, then you don't have to worry very much about the transportation. I have to worry about forecasting, but demand, and I have to understand a little bit about how long it takes them to make it, but transportation wasn't a factor. Now, transportation is a factor.
Yeah. Let's take a pause right now. I will repeat the question, and then we'll address some of the answers that we're getting in. So the question was, does inventory add value to your product?
Okay, we had one answer. having inventory allows us to respond to customer demand, but when it shifts, it hurts us.
That's certainly true. You know, in that case, having the inventory allows you to sell it. So there is a value to having inventory, but generally, if you have a product that's sitting in inventory, it's not improving. Generally, it is going the other direction. Amar pointed out earlier that there is one where it frequently is improving, and that's if it's wine. If you have a good wine and you have it stored in a good location, then it's getting better. But almost all of the things that you can think of being inventoried, being put in inventory, bad things happen. If you have cars that are inventoried at the dealer, they get scratched, bad things happen to them. They're getting obsolete. So typically, it's the case that the only value from inventory is that you need to have the right amount of it there when the customer wants it. We'll talk in a minute about the right amount of it. If we look for a minute at this question of transportation, if you look at my example, suppose I got a product and it's manufactured in Shanghai and it's distributed from Atlanta. So what I have to do, or what I might do, would be to ship it in a container to Los Angeles and then take it cross-country on rail until I get it to Atlanta. If I do that, typically it'll take 25 to 35 or 40 days to get it to Atlanta. So let's say it takes 28 days. If I have 2 containers a week that I sell, then I have 8 containers on average in transit all the time. So I have an inventory of product that is in transit that I didn't plan on it being in transit. I planned on the inventory I would have in Atlanta, but the amount that I have in transit is due to the physics of the supply chain. It takes 28 days to get there. If it takes 28 days to get there and I'm selling 2 containers a week, then I'm going to have 8 containers in transit on average. If I look at how much it contributes to inventory days, just that inventory contributes 28 days. So I've got 28 days of inventory, in this case, just out there floating around. Now, suppose occasionally there is as much as a week delay in Atlanta and Los Angeles. Oh, because I have these long supply chains and because I have to do a variety of things, I can't say it's going to take 28 days. I can say an average of 28 days, but I know there will be some variability. So sometimes, suppose it's 35 days. Well, if that's the case, then sometimes it'll be a week longer than the average. And if I never want to run out, then in Atlanta, I'm going to have to keep inventory to protect me if it's 35 days. That is, I can't assume it's 28. And it gets more complicated because there's more than one way to get it to Atlanta. The one alternative is take it through the Panama Canal, bring it to Savannah, truck it over, and bring it to Atlanta. In this case, suppose the average is about 35 days. If the sales are the same, then I'd have 10 containers in transit. Right? And so in this case, it would contribute 35 days. So you say, well, this is worse. It's worse because before I had 28 days, now it's 35. So on the one hand, it is cheaper to come through the Panama Canal than it is to come across country, but it's not so clear which of the two is better, because if I don't ever want to run out of inventory, then in addition to the 28 days I have in transit, I'm going to have another week, another 7 days that I'm going to have to keep in Atlanta to keep from running out. So I'm going to have safety stock in Atlanta that will protect me against running out. So now you say, okay, which one of those is the best? Well, had I rather have safety stock or had I rather have inventory in transit? And generally, I rather have inventory in transit in terms of cost because I don't have to have a warehouse to store it in. On the other hand, if I have it already in my warehouse, I know for sure it's going to get there. So we'll talk about some of those trade-offs and what has to happen.
At this point, Don, we have another question. Where, in a supply chain context, where do you put safety stock?
Well, generally, safety stock is kept in the normal storage locations, traditional storage locations. The retail, we often have safety stock. Warehouse, we often have safety stock. In a manufacturing plant, we often have safety stock. So we typically will have safety stock in the traditional places. We don't have safety stock in transit generally because we don't plan on the inventory in transit. Okay. The things that one has to do to control inventory have gotten more complicated. Traditionally, one of the things you have to do is to decide when you're going to order. Now, we talk about forecasting inventory, forecasting demand. And we do forecast demand, but from an inventory point of view, we don't actually care about the demand. What we care about is when we're going to run out of product. So what I really am doing is forecasting the run-out point. And the way I have to get there is forecast the demand and know how much inventory I've got, and then I can figure out when I'm going to run out. And so if I can forecast the run-out point, if I know when I'm going to run out, and I can forecast the lead time, I know it's going to take, in this case, 28 days, then what I'll do is I'll back up 28 days before I'm going to run out, and I'll order. And if everything is perfect, if I can exactly forecast when I'm going to run out, and if I can exactly predict how long it's going to take to get more product, and I execute perfectly, then everything would get there just in time. So I predict the run-out point, and demand is a part of that. I predict the lead time, and that's from the time I order until the time I get it. And then what I have to worry about is what if this system is not perfect? That is, what if my predictions are not perfect? Well, the first thing to note is that it is often difficult to make a prediction. In order to determine the run-out point, that means that I have to know how much stuff I'm going to sell. And so demand is typically not easy for me to predict exactly. Similarly, lead time means that I'm going to predict the impact of all these delays that occurred. So the more complex the supply chain, the more difficult it is for me to figure out what to make a prediction of the lead time. Now, in addition, long lead times cause me a problem. If I have to, if I know that I'm going to run out in a week and I can get product in a week, then I can make a pretty good prediction, generally, of what's going to happen during the week. If rather than a week, I'm talking about 6 months, it's much harder for me to predict 6 months in the future than it is a week in the future. So what that says is long lead times intuitively are not a good thing in terms of prediction. So long lead times have two bad things that happen. One thing is I have a lot of product that's out there in transit. But the other problem is that it makes it longer. I have to predict further in advance when I'm going to run out of product. Another thing is variability. And so if I have variability in demand, if the demand is fixed all the time, then it makes it much easier to determine when I'm going to run out. The more variable the demand is, the harder it is for me to predict. Similarly, if I have variability in lead times, it makes it much harder for me to predict how long it's going to take to get to product. So long lead times cause me a problem. Variability in demand cause me a problem. Variability in lead times cause me a problem. In terms of demand, we've gotten better at predicting demand. There's a huge amount of work that's gone into forecasting demand. For lead times are very much a function of the supply chain. And as the supply chains have gotten more complex, variability has gotten bigger. And we have not spent nearly so much time trying to predict variability. In terms of length of lead times, typically that is more or less ignored by the people who are deciding where to manufacture something. So we'll talk about that at some length. There's another question which comes up, and that's what is acceptable. So if I'm talking about fulfillment, what's acceptable? I've got my inventory, I've got my planned delivery. Now, suppose the delivery is late. Suppose I've forecast wrong. Either the demand is wrong or the lead time is wrong, but I've not ordered at the right time and the delivery's late. So if it's late, when the product comes in, I will have this green part where everything is fine, I've got product. And then when I have more product come in, I'm okay again. But this piece in the middle is not good, because for that piece in the middle, for that time frame, I'm not going to be able to satisfy my demand. So one question is, how often is it acceptable to be out of product? If somebody comes into my place of business, how often is it okay for me to be out? But another question is, how long? For how long is it okay to be out? So it's sort of one thing to be out of a product for one day. It's another thing to be out of the product for a week. So in order to come to grips with the problem of inventory and fulfillment, the first thing I have to do is I have to be able to specify what to me is acceptable. There's also a question with regard to the inventory. So one question is regard to how often and for how long it's okay to be out of a product. And another is, what is acceptable inventory? Well, if the delivery is early, then what happens is the inventory gets there before I need it. And if it gets there before I need it, then that yellow part is inventory that I don't need. I needed to come in when I ran out. It came in early. I've now got excess inventory. So what is too much excess inventory? How do I determine if my inventory is the right amount of inventory? The CFO always wants to cut inventory. So if they want to cut inventory, is it a reasonable thing to do? So a big question is, how much inventory is too much? And how can you make this trade-off between inventory and stockouts? So if I have more inventory, not always, but generally, if I have more inventory, I can have fewer stockouts. And so how can I make this trade-off? So if we want to improve fulfillment, things we could do, one thing is to be able to estimate better the run-out point and the lead time. So the better I am at doing that, then the more likely I am not to have orders too late, and the more likely I am not to have orders too early. In order to do that, one thing I certainly can have is better data. Now, with regard to demand forecasting, we have pretty good data now. With regard to lead time forecasting, in many cases, we do not have very good data. Even very big companies don't have very good data in many cases with regard to how much time it is going to take them to get their product. Shorter lead times. Certainly, if the lead times were shorter, it would be easier to predict. So one of the reasons that we're moving toward more nearshoring, manufacturing in Mexico as opposed to manufacturing in China, is that it gives us shorter lead times. And certainly anything we can do to decrease variability and uncertainty, that would help us to improve fulfillment. Visibility, if we actually know what is happening out there in the supply chain, then that will allow us to make better predictions. Make better predictions means we'll be able to make a better compromise between inventory and stock out. All right, one other point is the question of shipment frequency. My little example here, I've got one shipment every week, and here I've shipped twice a week. And so if I look at this and I say, okay, how does that impact inventory? Well, if you look at the once a week, you can see that I clearly will have more inventory than if I ship twice a week. In terms of fulfillment, what that means, if I look at the bottom one, it says, okay, there are going to be a lot more times when I potentially could run out of product. So if there's more opportunities to run out, then I'm likely to run out more. So shipping less frequently means more inventory. Shipping more frequently means less inventory, but generally more potential for stock out. So what that means is that for the lower case, I'll have to have more safety stock. And it is not an easy thing. It is reasonably easy to get the intuition right. It's a much harder thing to figure out what the policy should be that allows you to do this well.
Yes. We have a question for the audience at this point. Having gone through the slides, can you tell us, for your business, what would be the biggest causes of inventory that you face?
So if you could type your answer in the question chat field, we'll address those.
Okay, in terms of types of inventory, there are a variety. We've talked already about in-transit inventory. So in-transit inventory is dependent on how long it takes you to move the product. You've got the stuff that's waiting to ship, and that depends very much on how well you're synced up with the transportation capability. For example, if it's the case that you're located somewhere where the ships only call on the port once a month, then if you get it there the day after the ship leaves, then it'll wait for a month before it gets loaded on. There's the cycle or order to quantity inventory. That's the part that we just talked about a little bit, which has to do with how big the shipments are. There's safety stock, which is the natural thing that people think about when they think about inventory. There's seasonal inventory, where you have to get inventory in advance because typically you can't get enough of it during season. You've got in-process inventory, which we talked a little bit about. And then we've got just old stuff. We've got stuff that we wish we didn't have, but somebody kept on the books because they didn't get rid of it. Now, all of this is inventory, and if you go out and look at it, if you're in the business of selling widgets, all of these look like the same widget. They don't really look different. So what we really mean by types of inventory is what causes it. And it's important in studying inventory that you understand what the causes are, because the only way you're going to change the amount of inventory is to change the cause, change what makes inventory happen. And mostly what people want to do is they want to have less inventory. And they're pressured to have less inventory now more than ever. There's more pressure than there ever has been. The pressure comes from very high up in the company, and so it's important to address the pressure. And it's important to know what it is that you can change and what you have to do to change it. For example, if it's in-transit inventory and you say, how can I change that? Well, the only ways that you can change it are to make the transit time shorter. So you can have faster transit time, or you can source it closer to where you're going to use it. So it's important in every type of inventory to understand what it is that you can do to change it. The fact is now we have more data than we ever have with regard to inventory. And most of this data is not used very well. I would pose the question to the audience of how well they think they do in managing inventory. Generally, companies, even very big, very sophisticated companies, do a very poor job of managing inventory. Inventory is complicated. It's gotten more complicated because it's, for big companies, it's spread all over the world. So you have a lot of data, and the question is, what do I do with all this data? There are really sort of two broad classes of models that we'll talk about. One is the more traditional models, and these are models that you try to use to determine what the quantities are you should purchase, models you should use to try to help you to forecast, models to use to determine when you should order, what your ordering policy should be. And we will talk about whether these models are reasonable. And whether or not they're reasonable depends a lot on the business you're in. So it can be very reasonable for one business and very unreasonable for another. And unfortunately, when you buy software, the models in many cases are embedded in the software. And if you just apply the model, it doesn't mean that you're getting good answers. So the fact that you've applied an optimization model for inventory does not in any way mean you've optimized your inventory. So the second set of models are, how do I determine how well I'm performing? So the first set is to try to help you make the decisions, and the second set is to try to tell you whether or not you're making them well. So what is the cause of inventory? What can we say about demand? What can we say about order quantity? Is it too big or too little? What do we say about safety stock? Another thing that's made inventory far more complex is that every picture I've drawn is for a single product. And almost never are you going to purchase a single product. You're going to purchase multiple products, and often multiple products are going to be shipped together. And so first, the numbers are big. You have lots of products. And so it is very hard to draw a little picture like I've drawn for each one of the products. A good way to get insight, bad way to manage your inventory, because it's not unusual for a company to have 100,000 SKUs. And it takes a long time to draw 100,000 pictures. If you look at this little diagram, I'll again invite the audience to, first, there is one clear problem that's demonstrated by this. There is one flaw in the inventory system that is clear, and so you can tell me what the problem is. The other is what is the biggest cause of inventory? Why is there inventory there? And then you can ask yourself, do you know what the biggest causes of your inventory are?
I had a couple of answers to that question. One was long lead times and lack of a good logistical layout. So that was one answer for what is the single largest or biggest cause of inventory. And then we had somebody else mention the single largest cause is the variation in demand. We provide materials to service large medical devices, and it's often difficult to know what will break and when, which is a good point.
Yeah, demand, we continue to work on trying to be able to better understand and forecast demand. And it will always be a struggle, because you can't really, you never can get all of the variability out of that. But equally important is being able to determine how long it's going to take you to get product. And in many cases, we can do something about that, but have not. And so it's sort of one thing to have this cause of inventory that we can't do much about, and we can continue to work on it, but we'll never be able to overcome it. The other is if you have a cause of inventory you can do something about, and you simply have not done it. In that case, you're bearing the cost of this inventory unnecessarily. So partly it's things we can't do anything about, and partly it's because we just haven't tried very hard yet. All right, what are we going to cover in the class? Well, we'll start the class off, and we'll talk generally about supply chain basics to get everybody kind of on the same page. We'll talk in more detail about how supply chains have evolved and what we have now, and then we'll start with where we are right here with this presentation, and we'll focus on inventory basics. And the reason for focusing on inventory basics is that if you're going to manage inventory, you must have a fundamental insight with regard to what's causing the inventory, how much is intuitively reasonable. If somebody gives you a new inventory policy and you have more or less inventory based on this policy, you should at least have the intuition to say, okay, that makes sense or it doesn't make sense. Forecasting, we will spend a little bit of time on forecasting just because everybody should have a good understanding of forecasting, but it won't be the focus of the course. Integration is a problem now with inventory. In many cases, it is the biggest problem. I mean, what we have to do is we have to have a policy for fulfillment, which everybody buys into. We have to have a policy for what's okay with regard to inventory, which everybody buys into. We have to have a policy with regard to how you're going to try to execute on your inventory. When am I going to purchase new inventory? What kind of lot size am I going to have for the inventory? We have to have a strategy for gathering data, and particularly we have to have a strategy for transportation, because in many cases transportation drives inventory. So you've got your inventory manager, and if your inventory manager doesn't have any control over transportation, then you have a huge problem, because the inventory manager in many cases then can't impact it very much. We'll talk about different kinds of inventories, DRP, MRP. We'll talk about models for lot size and safety stock, replenishment planning. Demand planning, we'll talk about some, which is a higher level thing than forecasting. Forecasting basically means you're just going to try to predict what happens. Demand planning means you're going to try to influence what happens with your demand. And we'll talk about both how you might do that and what the impact would be. Supply chain design, in many cases your supply chain design fundamentally impacts what your inventory is going to be. Whether you have more facilities or fewer facilities, and we'll talk about that. And then the question of managing variability. If you could pick one focus that would most improve your inventory, it would be to have a good handle on your variability, to be able to understand what's making it, to be able to control it, predict it, all of those things. And then in terms of the format, we will use both a lecture format, and we will use a variety of case studies and exercises.
Okay, so we had one question, and I guess it follows along what you just mentioned about, should I bring along a laptop to the course?
You should bring a laptop to the course. If you don't have a laptop, then we will try to make arrangements, but if none of you have laptops, we have a problem making arrangements.
Okay, if you have any more questions, feel free to type them into the question chat window. While we're waiting on any more questions, I just want to mention, if you want to learn anything more about SDL or our initiatives, our professional education, our research, some of our other programs, just visit www.sdl.gotech.edu. If you want to learn more about the syllabus and the offering in April, you can go to www.scl.gottech.edu/INVMGMT. There you'll find a brochure about the course, a detailed syllabus. You can see what we're covering each day. And again, that's going to be April 24th through the 26th here on the Georgia Tech campus at our Global Learning Center, which is a really nice facility on the Georgia Tech campus. And we need to mention that we have a Facebook page. So if you'd like to join that, I mean, just look for Georgia Tech SCL in Facebook. We have a LinkedIn group. So if you search for Georgia Tech Supply Chain and Logistics Institute, you can join that group. We also have a Twitter account. You can follow us at GTSCL. And then we also have an account at youtube.com/GTSCL, where we will post this archive when it's available, as well as we have other recorded archives for different subject matter that we've presented on. So you can check that out and see what all videos are available out there. So I'm looking to see if there's any more questions coming in.
Well, there's one that I see there. What's the difference between variability and uncertainty?
Variability means it changes. So I can have variability day to day, week to week. Uncertainty means that I don't know how it's going to change. So if I had bigger demand every Monday than I had on Tuesday, then I have demand variability. But if I have my demand changes and I don't know what days it's going to be bigger on, then I have uncertainty.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So we want to thank you again for attending. We hope you found the session educational and encourage you to attend the live course April 24th through 26th. If you have any questions in the future, please email webinar@scl.gottech.edu. Thanks, folks. Bye.